Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and I just finished the short story collection Memories Legion from the Expanse series, which officially means that I've completed the entire Expanse series. It has been a long time coming. I didn't want to race through this one. I wanted to kind of go through the series at a normal pace and have time to sort of think about each book and think about what was going to happen and fan theories and all that kind of stuff. I avoided all the spoilers, which I'm very happy that I did. And I haven't seen the TV show yet, but now that I finished all of it, I definitely want to check that one out. And so this video is going to be just an overall non-spoiler review of the whole series in case you yourself are curious about checking it out as well. So one good thing about this series is that there's only 10 books total. There's 9 books in the main series, and then there's the collection of novellas and short stories that are kind of sprinkled throughout it. And so it's not a mega long series. It did take me a little over a year to read it, but that's because I was reading other books in between. I started reading Leviathan Wakes in December of 2023, and then I read the other main 8 books in 2024, and then I read this book beginning of 2025. So it was a little over a year to read the whole series while reading other things, and it's definitely doable. If I had read all of the books one right after another, I probably could have gotten the whole thing done in like 6 months. But I didn't want to rush through it. This was a series that I really enjoyed, and it's fun to just exist in this world. I know the creators initially wanted this to be an RPG, and so they did a lot of the world building for that first before they decided that it would kind of work better as a book series. And I'm really glad they did, because the world building in this is definitely one of the things that really draws you in. The way that we get to see political decisions have ramifications in the future. The books do cover quite a long span of time. The first 6 books cover like a few years, and then there's a time jump of like 20-ish years, 25 years, and then the final 3 books take place sort of in the future, and we get to see kind of the fallout from all the stuff that's happening in the first set of the series. The TV series, I haven't seen it yet, but from what I've heard, it sort of follows that first 6-book chunk, and it doesn't really go into the final 3-book kind of finale set in the future, which is fine. Maybe, you know, because the characters age naturally in the series, maybe that means that once a few years have passed, we can get the actors back together and they can give us the final 3 books in the series. Who knows? We'll see how it goes, but I'm looking forward to checking the TV series out. One thing that really pulls you in this one is the characters. There's multiple POV characters in each book. Every book sort of does have sort of Holden as the main character, so to speak. I think he's a POV character in almost every book, and in books where he isn't, he does show up as a POV character in a few interludes. So he is sort of the main character of the whole series, and we get to follow everything kind of from his perspective. But we do also get tons of other characters. This has got this kind of Dickensian scope to it, where you've got this massive cast of characters. You'll be introduced to someone early on who seems like they're just kind of a one-time POV character because of where they're placed in the story, and their perspective is important for that specific story. But then, like, books later, we'll see that character again, and they'll become really important, and then they'll become like a beloved main character later on, and I just love how that works. There's long threads that kind of follow throughout, and I love seeing how all the characters grow and change and evolve. The main core cast of the Rocinante crew is just wonderful. I love ensemble casts, and all of them are so great. There's sort of the more heroic characters, there's sort of the more chaotic characters with looser morals, and it really feels like this family. By the end, you're kind of getting choked up because you're seeing how everything's played out for everyone, and it seems like you've spent so much time with them that it really feels satisfying when you get to the end. One of my favorite things about the series is the way that it explores sort of philosophical and sociological concepts. There's a lot of questions about humanity, questions about government, questions about where people are going and what their potential can be and all this kind of stuff. What I really like about it is that it doesn't present any easy answers. One of my other favorite sci-fi kind of universes is Star Trek, and in that one, maybe not in the most recent series, but sort of in the 90s, in that era, there was this idea that sort of all of the answers are easy and we figured things out, and they might, come up with smaller things that would challenge it, but in the end, sort of their ideals would carry them through the trouble. And there are a few exceptions to that. There are a few episodes here and there where they sort of dig into sort of the flaws at the heart of that utopian society and how it can't really work the way they think it has without some dark secrets kind of at its core. And I think some of the newer series of that universe have started to look at more of the gray areas and have been telling really interesting stories. But what I like about The Expanse is that there's never an easy solution to anything. There's never if we just do this, then society will get better. There's always this sense that they try different things out and they try different ways of running a society, and there's some things that work well, there's some things that don't, but there's no one society that is sort of perfect. And I really like that sort of messiness in how it kind of grapples with the human condition. I think ultimately the series is optimistic because we do have characters like Holden feels like a Star Trek character who sort of pulled out of his universe and dropped into this universe where everything is messier. At the beginning of the series, he has this kind of naivete about him where he thinks that, if you just give everyone all the information, people are smart, they can make decisions for themselves. And what he doesn't realize is that there's always going to be corrupt people who are going to manipulate things. Not everyone has equal access to things. Not everyone has the same ideals. And so while people in general can be good, there's always going to be systems that people create. Some are good, some are not good, and that's just kind of the way things work. And I really, really love that. It's messy, but it makes you ask big questions. And even up to, right to the very, very end, the final short story in this collection is kind of a sequel to the series where we kind of follow one character after everything's happened. And it asks all those same kinds of questions where things are messy, people are always going to make mistakes, people aren't perfect, but you have to let people be people. And it's just, I love that so much. It's optimistic without being naive. And I think that's one thing that makes this series work as well as it does. Another thing about this that I really, really enjoyed was the sort of sci-fi-y aspects of it. There is kind of this cosmic mystery at the heart of the series that involves maybe aliens, maybe something else. We're not quite sure what it is. And at times it's monsters and very obvious threats, and other times it's more nebulous, shadowy questions about the fate of the universe and where everything is going and where it came from. And so it digs into these big things, but in a way that doesn't pull the focus away from the characters. The focus is always on what are the characters doing, what are their societies like, how do the societies get along or not get along, what are the decisions that people make. So it's always a very ground level kind of thing. But it does get into sort of what do people do when faced with vast existential cosmic threats. And I think it's done so well because it could have very easily been kind of over the top, and it could have ended up being kind of a Pacific Rim type story where you've got humanity facing off against giant monsters that are out to get them. And that's not the story this is telling. The alien aspect of it is always kind of half in shadow, and you're never really sure what that is, but the focus is always on what do people do when they learn about these things, and I think that works a lot better. There's also a lot of really great sociological questions. I love the culture and language of the Belter people, the people who live in the asteroid belt and kind of the airless moons around the solar system. and the way that their culture has changed, their language. They have a sort of Creole language that they speak that's sort of a mix of a bunch of different languages, and sort of how that's conglomerated into this new language. And there's this whole complex web of cultures, and there's even different Belter cultures depending on kind of where you are. So they're not a monolith. It's very sort of human and organic, and we get to see sort of what would people be like if they had to live primarily in spacesuits. They're not living in a gravity well on a planet. And then it also digs into sort of what is Earth like, what is Mars like, the messiness inherent in how different societies take care of their people. Earth does have sort of a lot of hallmarks of sort of this utopian society, but as always, it's not perfect, and there's a lot of flaws inherent in that system. So you've got things like universal basic income on Earth, but there's a messiness to it because you've got people who, there's this stigma on Earth where people don't want to just live on basic, and they want to make money for themselves, and there's always bureaucracy, and there's always corruption at different levels of the government. And so this ideal society that people have created may not always be serving everyone perfectly, because there is no perfect way to serve people. And there's lots of things that are good about life on Earth, there's lots of things that aren't, and this really digs into sort of the different facets of that. There's no sort of one perfect answer to anything. And the way that it looks at the fallout of certain discoveries, I won't give any spoilers, certain discoveries that sort of change the balance of power in the solar system and the effects that that has on different governments. And I really liked how real the whole world felt. It really felt like an actual living, breathing ecosystem of cultures and peoples. And I thought that was really effective. And I've mentioned the characters before, but I just have to say it again. There are some characters in here who are all-time, like, legendary greats. I'm just going to mention Christian Avasarala. I won't go into any details, but just she is one of the best fictional characters ever created, and I love her so much. And I'm really excited to see her kind of portrayal in the TV series, because I've heard that they made her character a little bit of a bigger presence in the TV series, which is great. And the actress they got to play her is phenomenal, so looking forward to that. Now, getting into some criticisms, because, you know, there's no thing is perfect. I will say that there are a few books in the middle, especially when you get into like book 3, 4, 5, that area, where there's a lot of setup for things later on. Now, I will say the series does end very satisfying. Everything does come together in interesting ways, and I wouldn't call those early books a slog. It's more just, if you don't know what's coming, it can feel a little sloggy. If I reread the series, because I'm definitely going to be rereading this in the future, those books I know right away aren't going to feel like a slog anymore, because knowing what it's setting up, it's sort of, you get a sense of kind of the momentum of the plot and where things are going. But the first time, there are some characters that feel like, why is their POV important? What's going on? I think there's one book where most of the story is just, we're traveling because we're going to meet up with someone and something's going to happen later. And so there is this sense that the plot is sort of oozing along at a slow pace. And so that is a valid concern. If it's a first-time reader, I can see some people bouncing off of those earlier books. The first 2 books are phenomenal. They're excellent. I really loved them. But sort of that 3, 4, 5, there's a lot of setup for future things. And there are some character POVs that are either a little hard to follow or don't immediately seem relevant to the main overall plot. They feel kind of like a digression, and it isn't until later when you kind of see how everything sort of fits together. So if you read the series for the characters, for the world building, for just existing in the world, I don't know if those books would necessarily feel like a slog at all. And looking back, there's a lot of important stuff in all of them, and there is good character stuff. They're not poorly written, they just feel like they're treading water a little bit. But if you're looking for sort of the level of action in the first 2 books to be sustained throughout the whole series, you're probably going to be a little disappointed, because those books are not as action heavy, and they're more about the rising political tensions, the decisions that the characters are making and how that affects the world, and all that kind of stuff. So it is something that should be said. I do think that those books could have been like tightened up a little bit, because people reading a long book series, it's a big commitment and it's a big time commitment, and if they feel like their time is being wasted, they're gonna go on and read something else. And I think that's one reason why it did take me so long to read it. I did want to take my time with it, but it was easier to take my time in between those books, because I wasn't as pressed to return to the series, because there wasn't necessarily a lot of gripping cliffhangers or anything that really would have kept me going. I'm glad I did return to it, because like I said, the final like 4 books are outstanding, and the huge scope of everything and the character arcs are all really satisfying, and I'm glad I stuck with it, because the series overall is definitely an all-time favorite of mine. It's one of my favorite sci-fi series now, and I really did enjoy it. But the pacing in those middle books is a little slower, so be aware of that. Another thing I want to touch on is reading order, because whenever you have a collection of short stories like this that are interspersed throughout the series, a lot of times they're going to want to know sort of what's the best reading order to get the most out of the story. And having read all of it, I'll say I did appreciate reading all of this at the end of the series, because I feel like this is a way, it's kind of like a victory lap through the events of the whole series. It starts out way before the first book and it ends after the end of the last book. And so there's nothing necessarily in here that is crucial information that you're missing not having read it. There are a few things where it's sort of the way it's revealed in the main series. If you read the short stories like when they're supposed to be read, you'll be introduced to certain characters at a different time than when you meet them in the main series, and it's not a spoiler, it won't ruin anything. So I'll say it's definitely up to you. I think you can just read this at the end, or you could even read everything in it except the last story before you finish the final book, as kind of a lead up to the finale, and then after you read the final book, then you can read the last book. But if that's too complicated, I would say just read all the short stories at the end, because the last story does end after the last book, so you will kind of end at a normal logical place. If you want to read it sort of interspersed throughout, you could also do that. I think the first 2 stories are set sort of before the beginning, and then the other ones are sort of in between certain books throughout. So it is up to you. I will say there's nothing in the stories that, if you haven't read the stories, you will be lost, but they do give some extra background information, and they also give different perspectives, because there's a few stories in here that give a look at certain aspects of the world that you don't really get to see in the main story, because it's telling a different kind of story. I will say it definitely is important to read these, because it fleshes out the world in really interesting ways, and the stories are all really important, so do read them. And they give a lot of insight into certain characters and their motivations and what's going on in their heads. There's one story that's told in first person, which is really interesting, and there's one story that's kind of told from an omniscient narrator, which we don't get in the main series. The main series is always close third, and so that story is really interesting, because we get a perspective that you don't get in the main series, and you learn things that you wouldn't learn if you were just following specifically one character's perspective. So if you're curious when to read this, I'd say the safe bet is read the whole thing at the end after you've read the final book, Leviathan Falls. If you want to look it up, you can look up when to read each series or each story before each book in the series. You can do that. It's a lot of work and you can be kind of jumping around, but you can definitely do that. I would say definitely read these. These aren't sort of an optional thing. There's lots of good stuff in here, and the final book, or the final story in this book, is very much a summation of sort of all of the themes that the whole series has been telling, and it was really satisfying. So with that said, I don't really want to dig into spoilers, and so I won't kind of go on a rant about all of the specifics of the story and how things go and where characters ended up and what I loved and, you know, what made me mad. I may do a spoilery video, maybe in shorts in the future. We'll see if I have a couple ranty things that I just have to say and I can't just let them go. But overall, this was a fantastic series. I loved it. Would highly recommend if you're a sci-fi fan, especially if you're a Star Trek fan, because I think this gives something that universe tries to give on occasion but doesn't quite manage, because it digs into sort of the messiness of things and it's not quite as neat and tidy. So would highly recommend this. Loved it so much. I'm just going to start repeating myself at this point. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.